And now, please welcome to the stage Managing Director of HX Venture Fund, Sandy Guitar.
You know, one of the people to introduce this panel now is Guillermo Borda. So a lot of people ask me things like, how do you put together Venture Houston? The answer is Guillermo Borda. The other question is, how did this whole HX Venture Fund thing get started? The answer is Guillermo Borda. And then the most asked question of the day, and you guys can know the answer, how did you get Gwyneth Paltrow? Guillermo Borda. Come on up.
Delighted to be here with you today, and it is now my distinct privilege to introduce the next panel. And I am delighted to also tell you that these individuals are truly extraordinary Houston leaders with a very proven and steady resolve to make Houston a phenomenal innovation ecosystem. Yes, all of us collectively have made great progress over the last few years in exceeding some target goals earlier than expected, some way earlier than expected. But the truth is we're only at an inflection point. We have much more work to do, issues to address, mountains to climb. We have much higher ambitions. And in a manner of speaking, we've only just begun. I assure you with conviction that if you were to run a regression analysis on the key factors for the collective success we have achieved so far, the factor with the highest correlation by far would be leadership. And this, for Houston leaders, embody the vision, optimism, and confidence of this leadership in a truly stellar way. I have had the privilege of working very closely with them, and I can assure you that is very, very genuine. So, with us today, Gina Luna, Managing Partner of GP Capital Partners, Paul Hobby, Founder and Managing Partner of Genesis Spark, Charles Tate, Co-Founder of Hicks, Muse & Tate, Chairman of Arva Intelligence and Yonder Hospitality, and last but by no means least, Bob Harvey, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Greater Houston Partnership. Without further ado, please help me give a warm appreciation for the many contributions they have made, and welcome our distinguished panelists.
Thank you, Guillermo. Well, thanks, Guillermo. It's a real pleasure to be part of this event today. It's been great to be here all day. And just to be part of this exciting moment for Houston. Here it is, 2022. Some of us have been working on this topic for a while, and we're going to start with a little bit of that history, but then very much move into the present and the future, which is what we really want to talk about today, the future of Houston in the innovation space. Now, someone accused me, it's been about a year, of always wanting to start with an origin story. I didn't even know what an origin story was. He says, Bob, every question I ask you, you go back to the beginning of time. Well, we're not going to go back to the beginning of time, but we're going to go back a few years and talk about where Houston was when it comes to technology and innovation. And I can recall Gina and Paul were both former chairs of the partnership some years ago. And I can remember conversations that we had, Gina, and I'll think of you first, where you came into my office and said, Bob, the Houston startup community, the Houston technology community feels really underappreciated by the community broadly and specifically by the partnership. And that began a conversation. You introduced me to people in the space. We started talking about what could be done better, what could be done differently. I want to ask you to go quite that far back, but maybe 5 years ago, because 5 years ago we have some data for where we stood. You probably have all heard this data reference. In 2017, just 5 years ago, $423 million in VC funding flowed to Houston companies. Last year, a record $2 billion when you get the actual data, it's like a 600% increase. So something's good has happened. But Gina, talk a little bit about that period of time from when we first talked several years ago, 5 years ago, when we asked Accenture to do some work. I don't want to take your thunder. Maybe that's going to be part of your answer. But Gina, take that history and take us to the present.
Thanks, Bob. And it's great to be here with all of you. And to me, this is a demonstration of part of that success and progress. I'll call it progress. We're not success yet, but we're on our way. And to me, the great thing this has all happened the Houston way. Just a bunch of people rolling up their sleeves, asking each other for help and advice, putting our mind to the task and making it happen. But I was reflecting earlier today on the way over here. I remember when we did the press conference to launch HX Venture Fund, and when we said what the goal was, which was $2 billion of VC investment in a year, in 5 years, many people, probably some in this room, laughed at us like there's no way. And, I don't think any of us really knew if that was possible or feasible or not, but it was a big goal, and we had all the right people locking arms to say this is really important for where Houston's going and where we want Houston to be in the future. And it's been, I think, some really big things that have happened along the way, like the ION and Greentown Labs across the street, HX Venture Fund 1 and Fund 2, and the visibility that that's created for Houston across the country and around the world to be seen in a different way. My favorite thing is Dana and Gwyneth said it this morning, like, I'm just blown away by what's here, and it's really more about shining that light. So, and then there's tons of little incremental things that have happened that help create this environment where entrepreneurs and startups succeed and grow. And we're in the early innings as I see it, but I think we got some good runners on base.
Gina always ends with a baseball reference. I'm just telling you that was to be expected. Thank you, Gina. Paul, what would be your recounting of Houston's history right up to the present?
Well, I think in a strange way, we owe Amazon a great debt of gratitude. You'll remember the HQ2 process that was much publicized, and it sort of ended with a fizzle. It sort of went to Northern Virginia, but whatever. It was never what it was originally intended to be, and whether or not they were head faking or over-promising in order to get incentives, I will leave that to other people. But you'll remember that Houston was the largest city disqualified the earliest in their graduated process. And the reaction among Houstonians was predictable. You had a moment where you could either be ashamed or you could be pissed off and do something about it. And we choose the latter, generally above the former. And so in a way, that was a big boost because we have all been part of previous exercises to improve the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And we can actually talk about those things, I think, candidly, and what we learned about what worked and didn't work. That'll be your choice to make, Bob. But I do think your point about leadership was the right one, that when I was asked to be some part of it, I looked around and I saw the people and I thought, wow, this time might be different, and it has. It's been quite different.
Been quite different. Let me pick up on a little bit of that because I have to go back to my origin stories again. So we were having that conversation about how to present Houston to Amazon, and it was a real struggle because the strengths we had in Houston were spread throughout the greater Houston area. You couldn't point to that one place, that one epicenter of activity and say, well, it's not everything, but if you go there, you'll see enough of it. So we recognized that was the deficiency, frankly, that we knew was going to be in our proposal. But we had a group sitting around a small table, and one person at that table was David Lebron, the president of Rice. And literally sitting at that table, he talked about, well, we're talking about this innovation corridor that would extend from TMC to downtown. And he kind of casually mentions in this small meeting, Rice Management Company owns some real estate right in the center of what you're describing as the innovation corridor. And in fact, the Sears store is actually owned by Rice. I didn't know any of this, right? That the Sears store was always a ground lease from Rice. And in that meeting, he said, it may not be relevant to the Amazon bid, But I think there's something that Rice can bring to this table over time, leveraging this asset. And boy, the vision of the ION to me, this is becoming that thing you have to have. You have to have that epicenter. It's not everything by any stretch, but you have to have that place where you can bring a one-time visitor, first-time visitor to Houston and see enough to get them back a second time or a third time. So what a gift that has been for our community. But that's just one of perhaps many elements of our success. Charles, I don't know if you were here this morning. Dana Settle was talking about Los Angeles and the fact that they always suffered from the proximity and the comparison to Silicon Valley. They were so close to San Francisco that they were overshadowed consistently in the sense of their VC community. They always had a hard time getting the VC community going in LA. And then they realized there were ways to leverage the media aspects. They were certainly known for media, and they figured out a way to connect that reputation of media to what was happening further north in the VC space. And since then, LA has moved. Now, they've moved beyond media, but they leveraged media. If I think there's an analog to Houston, I would think it would have to be energy. Though we'll talk about other aspects of Houston, life science, we'll talk about aerospace and the port, we'll talk about a lot of things, but we'll acknowledge that energy has always been kind of the crux of our economy and our reputation around the world. Can you think of a way for us at this moment to leverage energy to be that equivalent to perhaps to what LA did with media, to really catapult Houston into this venture space?
I can.
It's on.
So, I was in New York for a long part of my career, moved back to Texas in 2021, and I'd been at Hicks Muse Tate & First, and of course from that vantage point, we were a leveraged buyout firm, and Austin was Austin and Houston was Houston. And when I moved to Houston, there were two things that I decided. One was I wasn't going to contribute anything to the body of knowledge about real estate or oil and gas. So I've assiduously avoided each of those industries. But in 2000, Hicks Muse Tate & First established the Hicks Muse Tate & First Center for Private Equity at the McCombs Business School in Austin. And we did that because we wanted to encourage the development of the private equity business in Texas. It had gone from a business that was relatively small, episodic, to a real industry, generating and employing vast amounts of capital. And so we set that up to try and encourage the development of private equity in general in Texas. And you can't recognize Austin today versus what it was like at that time in private equity. And it's not to say that our institute is responsible for that, because it's not, but it certainly played a role. So in Houston, we were asked to make predictions, right? So my prediction is Houston will become the energy transforming environmental community in the world. It has a special place in the oil and gas industry. And as we go forward, I'm on the board of the Columbia Business School, and they believe that this environmental phenomena, which will play out here over the next 30 years, will be as transformative as the Industrial Revolution and the digital and internet age. And that will come from primarily the oil and gas industry. Now, why do I say that? If you go back to, do I have a few minutes?
A few, that's right.
So May of 2021 will be looked back on as the tipping point for when the United States got serious about the environment. And of course, it was the ExxonMobil proxy fight. And what that did, in very simple terms, is it made environmental issues a management issue versus a board issue. So what has changed is the capital markets made it clear to Exxon what they were unhappy about and what they wanted to see change occur at Exxon. So maybe Malcolm Gladwell will write a book, but if anyone identifies the tipping point for when the United States got serious about the environment, it will be May 2021. And all the data will support that. You look at the number of Fortune 500 companies that had net zero objectives prior to May, it's a fraction of what it is today. It's up to 30% of the whole Dow Jones is committed to. And it is primarily, and let me also say that it's absolutely essential that the continued development of the oil and gas sector occur while we're solving this environmental issue. We cannot destroy our way of life while we try and take care of the environment. It is possible to do both, and it will be the energy companies who are going to drive this. The capital markets are now responsible for it, not government regulation. The board of Exxon is aware of that. You can read articles about what's changed at Exxon since May of 2020. Well, it's happening across America. And it's the capital markets, and it's a voluntary market, not a regulatory-driven market. And the major oil companies and the major food companies, by the way, you will start hearing a term used going forward, which is a sustainability certificate. It is exactly equivalent to a carbon offset. The calculations to come up with that are exactly, one happens to be sustainably farmed crops grown on sustainably farmed farms, which have already been going through sustainable farming practices and have maximized the amount of carbon they have in their soil. And it's the food companies that are going to buy sustainability certificates from those because they want to advertise that their inputs are sustainably grown. But it's exact equivalent to what a carbon offset is. In case of Arva Intelligence, which I'm now chairman of and made a big investment in, it is a nature-based carbon offset company. And we are raising our Series A round right now, which we will close out in the next couple of weeks. Our lead investor is a major oil company, followed by one of the major oil and gas service companies, followed by a number of individuals and a very small spattering of venture capital firms. What we found out, this particular company has 450 people in their company working on carbon offsets. 450. They have been looking at this for 20 years. They are also, in addition to being the major buyers, they also are going to set the standards for what they're prepared to buy, which will set the standards for the market. Because the Exxon board, being embarrassed by losing that proxy fight, they're not going to get embarrassed by greenwashing. They're not going to go and buy a carbon offset that they can be challenged on that it's a valid, and so they will set the standard. So whether it's Microsoft, Google, they're buying thousands of carbon offsets. They are defining the criteria that must be met. Right now, the market is controlled by Checkpoint, which are these verifiers. And of course, Houston has one, B Carbon. But they are all nonprofits. They simply don't have the capacity to grow and to meet the needs of the market. And these buyers are going to set the standards, and the world's going to follow them. And so the major oil companies are driving this demand. They're also going to drive what the solutions are. And Houston will end up being the capital of the energy transition, alternative fuel is in the world.
Yeah, you can
and that's
tell.
In the future.
You can tell. We could indeed have an all-day session talking about the technology aspects of the energy transition. Charles, you and I would be there for sure. I expect this whole panel would be there. I don't want to leave the impression with this group that we're only about the energy transition. And I told Gina I'd ask her the question of kind of fill in around energy. What else are you seeing today in Houston as kind of the promising technology plays that are occurring in Houston or have the potential to grow in Houston?
No surprise, when we think about building the innovation ecosystem and attracting and growing companies here, you want to play to your strengths. And part of a huge strength of the region is the industry that's here. And I won't exclude energy or oil and gas from that because that is a big part of who we are, but there are a lot of associated industries and even some that are, distantly associated that we're seeing incredible innovation and companies either form or come here. So, start with space is pretty darn important here and seems to be attracting capital and attention. everything around mobility and logistics and how goods are moved. Again, that's pretty important. There's a lot to work with here in that regard. I personally think there is a ton of opportunity that is happening now and will accelerate as it relates to, I'll broadly call it material science, which is tied to all of these industries. And, the common thread of so much that we talk about is these are big world problems that Houston innovators, Houston companies, the academic community are addressing in a very significant way. And sometimes I will sit and listen to an entrepreneur. Paul and I have just met one recently who's describing what they're doing, and you're thinking, holy cow, this is like change the world kind of stuff, and it's happening right here. And the opportunity from an impact perspective, but also from a financial perspective, is huge. And again, so I think there's tons of opportunity. I remember in the early days of all this, we spent a lot of time thinking about what sectors were we going to focus on, what specific industries. And the reality is, I think if we continue to do the right things to build the infrastructure that supports entrepreneurs and helps people work together, we don't have to pick the winners and losers in terms of sectors. People self-select, companies self-select to be here and be a part of the best city in the world.
Thank you, Gina. As you said, it's not our role to pick the winners and to pick the sectors. I do think there's some sense in Houston, what unifies us, though, is we're oriented towards the world's biggest problems. I mean, as when we talked years ago about, we were probably too late for the B2C digital play that drove the previous decades. And we started thinking about what are the B2B challenges, where is technology embedded in hard tech, what are the things that we can do uniquely? But I think that's where we settled, that we in Houston should work on the really big problems. That's what we're mission-driven Houstonians. We're global. We take things out to the world. Paul, what do you think are the impediments? What are the challenges? What are the things that, sitting here today, 2022, are issues that we still need to address, deficiencies we need to overcome, or just things we need to recognize?
Well, let me deal with, Bob and my own elephant in the attic, and that is 313 that was repealed by the legislature because I think it had been subject to abuse, and there's some good efforts going forward from the metro groups and the Greater Houston Partnership to revive 313 such that Texas has an arrow in its quiver when it comes to economic development incentives. But I don't really agree with the passing of it. And when people call me about moving to Texas and incentives, I say, well, here's the deal. We don't confiscate enough private wealth to need to return it to newcomers. But if you run your P&L over 10 years, you will have gotten the $275 million that Charlotte, North Carolina was otherwise offering you. It comes out. It all comes out for all the good reasons. So whether or not we need a more comprehensive public economic development tool, I'll leave that to greater minds, but I don't agree with the passing of 313 as much as many do. My son works, until recently, he started at McCombs, but he worked at the Tesla factory in Austin and built the first Model Y line. And you look at that and you go, wow, it's an interesting moment. The most advanced manufacturing facility in the world is in Austin, Texas. Well, I sort of grew up there. It's a college town. Michael did this nice little Dell thing up in Round Rock, and it's a state capital, but it's not built for logistics. So I always wonder, why is that thing there rather than here? Because it's much more of a Houston thing in terms of its throughput and logistical requirements. But what does Houston need? There's plenty of other Teslas in the world that we can capture. I think one thing that Houston needs is commitment from our institutional investors. And I have hit this note several times, and I'm sorry if you're having to hear it again. I think we've gotten better. HX Venture Fund is certainly a step in the right direction. But, I have had conversations over 20 years with people that run large endowments, foundations, hospitals, universities, and sort of say, gee, of your $330 million alternative investment portfolio, how much of that stays around here. And, you know, I've had people look me straight in the eye and said, well, we can't do that because we have a fiduciary obligation to maximize returns for our retirees or our whatever they are. And I'm like, do you hear yourself? Do you know what you just said? That's gotten better, but it's still not nearly where it needs to be. You know, money is a herd animal, and it tends to run to either coast through established patterns and Harvard Business School connections, since I'm picking on Bob anyway. So we need more institutional support. And in the life sciences area, we need a success story, because, you know, the reason we have security software, we have a footprint there because we have, you know, some Blade server stuff. That's because of Compaq. The security cluster here is because of BMC. When you have a big success story, you spin out this commercialization class that we've never had in life sciences. And so that's what I want. I want more institutional capital to spend its alternative investment allocation here, and I want a big success in life sciences.
Be good. I'm going to come back to Charles, but you know, one of the issues we identified a few years ago is that our success in private equity, particularly directed towards the energy business, the shale play, had kind of kept people focused on a form of investing that had been seen as very successful. So to Paul's point, you just couldn't get people to look beyond private equity to think about VC investing in Texas. I mean, we did a pie chart once. Gina, remember that pie chart we did that had 98% of the private capital flows from Texas high net worth people went to energy-oriented private equity. Now, I do think there's been some movement. The PE firms themselves have moved into the space, at least late-stage investing. But Charles, I want to ask you, how do you see the kind of the investment community reorienting itself, and maybe specifically around VC? Do you have a perspective on, kind of to Paul's point, what do you see as the outlook for VC investing here in Texas?
I don't think Texas as a whole has an issue as regards VC investing. I mean, if you look at what's happening in Dallas and Austin, you know, it's a very vibrant, particularly Austin. And capital, you know, moves freely. I mean, it's capital isn't constrained by geography. You know, capital wealth in the world is awash with excess capital. There's a tremendous amount of liquidity. What the world is short of are good investment opportunities. So it's no matter how do you match the two up. And so my own fundraising experience in the private equity field is, for many, you know, this goes back 30 years in raising, is that it's been difficult with Texas institutions in terms of the ones that are on the forefront of developing investment, you know, theories and what have you. You have some very large money in Austin, but you know, it's been certainly in the Houston community, such a real estate, oil and gas, and it's been so successful for so many people for so long that, you know, trying to understand this whole technology, it's not easy. I'm not a venture capitalist. I really admire what, you know, the role that venture capitalists play and how they allocate capital to new ideas. It's not something, you know, I have done. Even though I've started companies, that's different than, you know, what a venture capitalist does. But I think some of the other things that are important is HX Ventures, and I also think the Greater Houston Partnership. So there aren't very many cities where you have such a close alignment between the private and public sectors. And it's one of the reasons Houston is what it is. And it's one of the reasons Houston doesn't have many of the problems that a lot of other major cities have. There's always been a dialogue between the public and private sector about what do we need to anticipate to allow Houston to continue, you know, to prosper. HX Ventures, to me, is going to be a major contributor to this phenomenon. If you know, we're modeled after a program in Detroit. Started off identically, I mean, we just modeled what they've done in Detroit. And that first model requires you to raise capital from corporations in your city and then match them up with technology by investing, creating a fund of funds and invest in a lot of venture funds and then trying to match up the portfolios of the venture funds with the major company. I think they're on their third fund. They may be on their fourth fund. They raise it totally in the private sector because of the track record. And I believe HX Ventures is going to have an attractive track record like this that will allow people in Houston, individuals, to invest in a diversified portfolio of technology to get their feet wet and not have to make discrete decisions about a technology. That's really hard to do. I don't need to tell you. Every entrepreneur's got a great story. Trying to sort that out without the technical background or the skill is really fraught with danger. So I think HX Venture, it's now been embraced by the Greater Houston Partnership, and that's a big step forward.
Well, thank you, Charles. Gene, I'm gonna throw you a curveball. When I was on the Texas A&M Foundation Board 15 years ago, when the A&M Foundation Board made its first investments in VC, and of course we didn't even consider any Texas firm, right? You're now on the A&M Foundation Board. I mean, how have groups like that matured in their thinking about VC investing, assuming that they have?
Well, I think I put my hat on the number of foundations, boards that I sit on, Welch Foundation, the A&M Foundation, and, VC is a big part of the portfolio, and it's very deliberate in terms of, the asset allocation, and then within VC, the asset allocation. Still not as much as we'd all like. I mean, asset allocation doesn't get down to the geography of the asset or of the fund necessarily, but I will tell you, there is a lot of conversation when we're talking about funds to say, this one is local and that matters to us. Unfortunately, there's not yet enough local non-energy VCs to choose from. Yeah. So I like Charles, I don't really advocate people making their own, VC individual company type investments unless you're really good at it and have experience, because that is a good way to stop being a VC investor. So part of our work is to continue to bring more local funds to be successful here, so we have that option. There are some great ones, but not as many as we need or would like to have.
Paul, I know you get irritated anytime we compare Houston to Austin.
Paul never gets irritated. I don't know what you're talking about.
Paul, but Charles referred to Austin earlier. Where do we need to go in Houston to deal with the fact, frankly, that we have a very successful brother or sister right down the road doing very well? How do we position Houston given that setting?
Well, again, I've lived a lot of my life in Austin, so I celebrate their success, and I, couldn't be happier for them. And, Josh Bayer and Capital Factory, if we're talking about entrepreneurial ecosystems, if you haven't been to Capital Factory in Austin, you should. It has a thump that is very educational and informs you, what these things have to look like. They can't be 9-to-5 nonprofits with the soft hum of air conditioning. So I begrudge Austin none of its success. I do scratch my head on the Tesla thing, but you've already heard me on that. But Houston is a real city that makes real stuff, and in the digital manufacturing world, for example, can you name the leading 3D manufacturing company in Houston? I can't either. That's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. It's what we do. It's what we do. We're the engineering capital of the world, deep space, deep oceans, deep in the genome. But ultimately, we make things, and software is important to make things that make things do better. But that's what I want more of in Houston. And if I'll allow one more moment of personal privilege, if you listened to Dana Settle this morning, she was talking about her move from Silicon Valley to LA, and that they had stood up this little, I suppose, online media function. It was called C or something like that.
Yeah, .LA.
Yeah, it was called .LA, and it was just basically this sort of broadsheet that covered the tech ecosystem in Los Angeles. And she said, it's such a little bitty thing, but it was important to us, and it sort of created connective tissue in a city like Houston that's so incredibly distributed. We're nuclear resistant in Houston, but communication suffers as a result. Well, all of you know that Ann Stern at Houston Endowment, the Kinder Foundation, and the Arnold Foundation are standing up a new daily online newspaper for Houston in a nonprofit environment. You know, each of you need to call them today, and we're going to say, look, let's make sure the communications beat, you know, has its own space, has its own place to communicate and circulate. I think there's a great opportunity there, and so I'm going to call Ann Stern this afternoon, and you should too.
She'll appreciate that, Paul.
She will appreciate that.
Thank you. All right, I'll ask Gina and Charles to end with this question as well. So what do you think we should be, could be, need to be doing better in Houston to move innovation, technology, investing forward? Gina?
I think the challenges and the opportunities continue to evolve. So the way that all of us can support, you know, it has to evolve too. And we have to address the challenges of the day, not the challenges of 5 years ago. And I do see that happening. You know, I encourage people to take personal ownership of this. It's not going to be done by any one big company, not, you know, just by the Greater Houston Partnership or by Houston Exponential. It's really thinking about what can I do, what can you do, which means help somebody, participate, tell the story, give somebody advice, introduce them to somebody they need to know. It's amazing how that works. I mean, that's how we got here, really. If you see an opportunity or you see a problem, tell somebody who can help you solve it. Don't just tell somebody. You got to take the next step to say, how do we address this? But, you know, let's keep the great momentum going and be a solution, not a problem.
And Charles, not throw you a curveball, but let me narrow it a little bit, because you referred to ExxonMobil before and kind of the changing attitude. What more can the corporates in Houston be doing? Do you sense they're doing enough, and do you think there's more they can be doing to support the venture space than perhaps they are currently?
Well, since I got back to Texas in 2020, been involved in a number of initiatives, either on the part of the city or the state, to try and accelerate the development of private equity and venture capital. And I don't think that's necessary any longer. I really don't. I'm not sure I see any major impediments that some governmental body can influence in a favorable way. However, what I do see is Texas was founded with a tremendous appreciation for education. And it was their view of how to break out of poverty. So the University of Texas was established, Texas A&M, and we've had this history. And so there are some major forces at work in Texas, whether it's the Welsh Foundation, which has set up the Welsh Institute with Rice University in advanced materials, or whether it's the Cancer Prevention and Research Institute of Texas, which is the largest source of funding for cancer prevention research in the world, only behind the NIH. And you have the Texas Medical Center, which is the largest medical complex in the world. But if you want to be at the front end of the digital internet revolution, the equivalent of that, you need to be in Houston, because this is where it's going to be. It's not going to account for everything, but it's going to have the same position in 20 years that Silicon Valley had in that particular sector. And if it's as revolutionary as that, or the Industrial Revolution, you want to be part of that. And it's an extraordinarily welcoming city. All you have to do is come here and volunteer your time and support local institutions, and anyone will introduce you to anyone. You tell them who you want to see, and they will absorb you into this community, and you can become an integral part of it and integrate yourself in an extraordinarily short part of time. And that is not true of a lot of communities.
Thanks, Charles. I'm going to go to the questions that have come from the audience. And I'm going to go to the one, it's anonymous, but several of you have asked it. And I'm sitting here looking at the question and looking at our panel. This is not the most diverse panel of the day, ethnically. I won't give excuses for that. I'm pleased with the fact that the program for the day overall has more ethnic diversity than this panel by far. But in terms of leveraging the diversity of this city, embracing it and making sure that we're providing opportunities for that more diverse Houston that we're all proud of and we all talk about, and we say we're going to make this the most inclusive city, including the venture space. I'd just be curious as to what thoughts you have about what more could we be doing, what are we doing to be sure that that's evident in all aspects of this innovation system. And Gina, since you at least represent gender diversity, any thoughts on that score?
Well, you know, I think it's a great question, and it's one we've talked about since the beginning. I mean, I remember when we kind of laid out our tenets for building the ecosystem. One, it needed to be an ecosystem open to all, and I think we said something like rising tide, lift all boats, and I still believe that's true. And I see lots of headlines that talk about, you know, Houston's attractiveness to diverse entrepreneurs. And so one, I think that has to continue to be a priority, and that we are deliberate about finding ways. And I don't think it's an easy answer. Unfortunately, it's not a one size fits all. It's always asking the question, always, you know, challenging ourselves where we might not be seeing or doing something that could be more inclusive or could create more opportunity. But in many ways, I go back to my earlier point of it's incumbent on every one of us individually and within our firms to think about what can we do, what are we doing to make sure that, you know, the ecosystem we're building reaches all the people who want to participate and be a part of that ecosystem. And, you know, certainly the diversity is in Houston. Let's just make sure that the resources available are helpful to everyone.
You know, I've appreciated the fact that we've seen a lot of targeted organizations formed to specifically address different ethnic groups, different gender groups, different parts of the community, just in terms of geography. You know, we sit here right at the edge of Third Ward, sitting here. And I didn't appreciate, it took more than just goodwill and intent. It took groups forming to say, we're going to focus specifically on building a bridge to this segment of Houston. And that's what gets me excited. People have stood up and said, hey, I want to make it happen. I'm going to make it happen with this group. This building, again, has become the crossroads for a lot of that activity. And I give Rice credit. When they decided to put this here, they made a commitment to the community to be inclusive that they have really followed through with. And you see that represented. If you walk around this building and see some of the signs of who's taking space here, you really see that. Anything to add to that, Paul?
Well, I think, you know, we are 50% Aggies up here, and that is a problem. I agree. But in all seriousness, I mean, diversity is who Houston is. You know, and when people talk about coming here, I'm like, if you don't like diversity, do not come. You know, I grew up with the children of Saudi Aramco executives, you know, blocks from here. So everything that defines Houston, space, energy, logistics, and medicine, are inherently global. Houston feels like that when you walk around. And I just encourage you to look at your own life. If you're hanging around people that look just like you, you're not hanging around the smartest people in Houston. So you might want to reevaluate some of your relationships. But in terms of some sort of a guilt trip around diversity, Houston can skip that part of the movie. You know, I have a running argument with the Chronicle. They don't really care, but are there minorities in Houston? Well, do you have to have a majority before you can have a minority? Well, we had a majority in Houston for some time. So again, I celebrate who Houston is. That's how we got here. That's who we are. But I do think we can spare ourselves the heavy guilt trip that a lot of other places may need.
I'm looking at some other questions here. You know, well, one question, again, is anonymous. We often talk about our strengths in the sciences and in hard tech, but traditionally the source of much venture capital is software. I do sense that Houston is trying to do something that may be a bit atypical in terms of hard tech and embedded digital and digital as standalone. We're trying to do something here that really integrates hard tech and traditional soft tech. What's the likelihood that we can do that? What are the challenges of doing that? What's it going to take to get VC money to see some integration of soft tech and hard tech? Because, you know, I was in Silicon Valley 2 weeks ago. And in one meeting, we mentioned hard tech, and the person just said, I never do that. I will never do hard tech. It is too difficult. It takes too long. I'm not going to do that. The very next meeting, the person in a different VC firm said, I'm all about hard tech. I think that's the future. I think we've got to learn how to integrate digital and hard tech. But you've got both camps out there, and I suspect really the former camp may be larger than the latter camp at this moment. Maybe I'm wrong. But what do you think about, Gina, how do you think about integrating that?
Well, I'm not the expert at any of that. But what I think is matching up, they talked about it this morning, Gwyneth and Dana, matching up the right opportunity with the right investor as fast as you can is so critical. Everybody knows that capital raising takes too much time and it's, inefficient in many cases. And so everything we can do to help people get in front of, there are people that will invest in all those things. And we need solutions in all those areas. So to me, the opportunity is to reduce the friction by having good information that helps us match the right opportunity to the right investor base as soon as possible.
You made reference much earlier, just in passing, to the Welch Foundation, of which you're a board member. And of course, the Welch Foundation made a $100 million contribution to Rice for the Welch Institute for Advanced Materials. And I think part of the conversation with the hard tech investors is to convince them that we have the leading edge technology in these fields. We're not a follow-on here. This is where synthetic biology is taking place. A lot of the things that are going to be the next generation of activity are happening here with the global experts sitting here. That's a little bit different. We're not playing a Me Too game here. We're saying, hey, we're going to lead the world in this respect. But I didn't put a question mark, but feel free.
Well, as it relates to the Welch Institute, that is the notion that this will be, the center of the universe where new materials are created and applications are determined that solve big problems for the world. And you called it a contribution. I always call it an investment because that's really the way we think about it. It's, in our mind, hopefully not a one-time thing. It's a down payment to helping Houston, and Texas realize its potential and have this huge transformational impact on the world. But you're right. The first thing that has to happen for that is we have to attract the smartest people in the world here to believe that that can happen here. And, that's not a small order, but I believe we'll do it.
I think we can too. Well, let me kind of end with that. Part of the message of this session was to reinforce the fact that Houston truly has come an incredible distance in the last 5, 6, 7, or 8 years. That's not to say we don't have a lot further to go. We're in the game. We've got momentum. We have the chance to win, but it's going to take a continued effort to have any chance of really being a major player. But this has been a city where when people pointed out an issue as something that needed to be addressed and dealt with, we've addressed and dealt with it. And so I would encourage all of you to continue to channel, whether it's to the partnership, HX Venture Fund with Sandy and Guillermo or others, where we have deficiencies right now, and I know we have them. We want to hear them. We're not Pollyanna-ish. We know we've made progress, but we have a long way to go, and this is highly, highly, highly competitive, as we know. So please let us know. Sandy, I know you'll let me know, so thank you very much.
Let me just add my thanks to everybody here. Charles, Gina, Paul, and Bob. Every one of these individuals answer my text, Guillermo's text, drop things and help us out every day of every week to make sure that Houston is benefiting from this concept, illuminating the path of venture capital here in Houston. So tremendous thanks to all of you for sharing your time and your influence every day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.